we will begin the conference, the sessions, the papers, and we'll begin with Deepaji. Deepaji has put together a fantastic paper exclusively for this conference, and all of you have seen her contextual presentation, context presentation. So over to Deepaji. Deepaji, request you to take over the session. Her session is The Art of Listening in Oral Traditions of India, Purpose, Possibilities, and Patterns. I've had the opportunity to get a glimpse of this, and it's going to be a fantastic paper. Welcome, Deepaji.
Namaste, thank you very much. As always, it's such a pleasure to listen to Professor Nagaraj Garu and new insights each time, and the old ones get reinforced again. So without further ado, I will quickly start and quickly finish. So I'd like to start with why I'm interested in this topic. The title is The Art of Listening in Oral Traditions of India, the Purpose, Possibilities, and Patterns. So even as a child, I realized that listening is what held my interest. And a clear memory is when my elder sister was, on the tape recorder, telling out a story with all her sound effects. It was a story of Avayad and how she got the fruit from Muruga. And then Vetri Vela, and she was busy recording her own version of it. And before, uninvited, I landed up into her recording and I was telling all the dialogues of Muruga. And I just went on, and my sister was complaining to my mother, I was, not only had I heard it and simply learned it by listening, I could not stop myself from wanting to share. I have many episodes like this of, watching something on television, imitating it incessantly till I sounded almost like the person on TV. As a teacher, I noticed that when I told stories to my students, even in substitution periods, they had that smile for me that was reserved only for their best friend. All they had done is listen to me. Perhaps I felt that what had also happened is that they had been listened to. And that brings me to the idea that whenever I'm asked, how can one be a good storyteller? The answer that spontaneously and repeatedly comes for me is by being a good listener. To be a good storyteller, you need to be a good listener. So I find that story, listening, storytelling are all interconnected with this web of presence and gift of listening to one another. And that's why I'm looking at speaking about the art of listening in oral traditions. And also as a parent, yes, as a parent, as a mother of two teenage boys, I have seen truly the power of how me telling and me listening has also triggered a listening, telling, trust, bond, relationship between the children and me. So I am quickly going to narrate a story to establish one of the ideas. This is a story from the Upanishad, and this is the story of how the Devas up in the heavens, indulgence with all their luxuries was a way of life, and the Asuras in the underworld, cruelty, conquering the other, procuring what belongs not to them was a way of life. And the humans on earth, going about their duties, collecting, saving up for the future was a way of life. And each one thought, our life could be better. It could be improved. And they all prayed. They all prayed and received one answer, or perhaps not even an answer. What they really heard was thundering sound. And from the thunder, da, da, da. All three of them went back absolutely pleased. The Devas thought, oh, da means damyata, self-restraint. We have to hold back from our indulgent life. And the humans thought, Da means datta, to be doing charity, generosity, to be giving away. We are simply holding. That's the answer. And the Asuras thought Da must mean dayatvam, compassion for the rest. That's what we need to have. We are being so cruel. This story is a classic example, a story that I've always known, and I happened to hear it again when I was reading a book of Daji's from Mindfulness Meditation, where again he speaks about the idea. This story is a reminder of an inherent understanding of the nature of narrative, as Professor Nagaraju Garu spoke about the narrative analysis, the nature of analysis that inherent of narratives that inherently they will reach the listeners in different ways, not necessarily as intended by the speaker. So, talking of reception theory and reception aesthetics, we can go back to Hans Robert Joss's work in literary studies, which was carried forward in cultural studies by Stuart Hall and later on brought to performance because Stuart Hall's context was television and multimedia, and it was brought to performance theories by Susan Bennett. Everyone is saying the same thing, that it is important to remember that what the speaker might be saying can be different from what the listener receives and will be different and meaningful depending on the context of the listener. This, for me, is one of the starting point examples of how knowledge of the listener, knowledge of the process of listening, the knowledge of how being listened to was deeply understood in this rich oral tradition of India. Not only that, we have actual information about the categories of listeners called as the adhikari. The listener was called the adhikari, and they were categorized as the uttamadhikari, madhyamadhikari, and the adhamadhikari. The adhamadhikari came to a story, came to listen to a story or watch a story, expecting pure entertainment. That's it. The Madhyamadhikari came looking for entertainment and art and believed there is something more to a story, but perhaps never understood it. The Uttamadhikari, who was another level of listener, would come not just looking for entertainment and not only art and aesthetics, but also to go back with some deeper meanings and understanding of life and living. Interestingly, this categorization of the adhikaris as Uttamadhikari, Madhyamadhikari, or Adhamadhikari was not judgmental or not with a condescension at all that, oh, they only want entertainment, the Adhamadhikaris, or oh, they want something. It was just information for the storyteller to know that wherever you go, dear storyteller, you will find different kinds of listeners. It is up to you to cater to each one of them. And that is what the best of the storytellers did, whether it was Nannaya in 11th century, who when he wrote the Mahabharata also kept in mind the Adhamadhikari. And therefore, the sounds, the poetry, the rhyme and the rhythm was so important because that in itself could be engaging for his listeners. I'm reminded of Ramcharitmanas, Tulsidasa's, which Tulsidas also believed that it was important to make it accessible to all his listeners. I have a childhood memory and I haven't been able to trace down the actual lines and I could be misquoting, but that is a reminder of how, even as a little child, it just stayed with me. A little poem about how Hanuman crossed across the ocean, and it went like this. लपट कराल ज्वाल जाल माल दंडिश धूम अकुलाने पकिचाने पौन का हिरे पानी को ललाट ढललाट करे पात जात माई रात. Whether it was texts that were written earlier or even a Potachitra artist narrating their story today in Midnapur district, perhaps, Mamuni Chitrakar or anyone else, they would also use musicality in their telling. Dariya mache biye korate cholo go romila. Dariya mache biye korate cholo go romila. A same line about the river fishes, wedding and marriage. but a musicality to engage a different kind of audience as well. This, again, the significance of sound was what brought this. The belief that anything has to be composed primarily for being heard, primarily for being listened to, was always in the background, in the mind of the storyteller when it came to how it was articulated, which is why the rhyme and the rhythm and the meter and the poetry were all given the kind of significance they were given, is what I understand. Even a mathematician like Hemachandran, who worked on mathematics, but also looked to Sanskrit, looked to poetry, looked to long syllables and short syllables to be able to explain what today we call the Fibonacci Hemachandran series. That was about the presentation aspect where the listener comes in. And talking about the format very briefly and quickly, even in the format of a telling, it was always kept in mind that there will be conversationality. Most of the stories had a story inside the story, that someone is telling someone and someone is listening to it and then telling someone telling someone, listening and telling someone else, which is really the nature of life itself. Not only that, it placed the listener centrally, planted the listener right into the narrative. It planted the questions of the listener right into the narrative. It planted the doubts, the concerns, the anxieties of the listener. Also, it served to guide the listener in certain directions, which can be seen in examples of presentation. For example, the Harikatha. You have the chorus that goes, oh, aha, which is sort of doing both things, mirroring what the listener might be feeling and also guiding the listener on what they ought to feel. Yimiti, alaga, ayo. All of these in the middle of the narrative would be guiding the listener as well. So the listener was placed so centrally in the narrative in ways of formatting, in ways of presentation, and it became integral to how a person composed, structured their story, how a person composed the presentation of their story. So these were a couple of examples. The purposes, as the title started, thus summarizing this, the purposes would really become somebody is looking for art, somebody is looking for entertainment, somebody is looking for a practical understanding of life, which might come from Panchatantra. Somebody is looking for a deeper reflection on its meaning. And nevertheless, the manner in which it was given was deeply, deeply significant and important. Let us take the Festival of Pongal, wherein the Haridasu is invited to sing songs of Hari, just to remind everybody, just to remind all of us that there is so much that is beyond us. And this message, like a Falashruti, may or may not travel through the mind and may just osmotically be transferred. Hari Re Rangama Ji, Hari Re Krishnama, Hari Re Rangama, Hari Re Krishnama Ji Rangama, Ji Rangama. Narratives like this hoped to at times go beyond the story itself. And what really always became significant was the telling and the listening, the telling and the listening, and the telling and the listening. With that, I come to the end. And I 10 minutes are up. There's another 3 minutes. Yes, I'd like to come to the conclusion of what I understand of this role, this pivotal role of the art of listening being so central, almost like listening becomes the purpose. The telling and the listening becomes the purpose. The story could be anything. I'm reminded of course, the Katha Sarit Sagar, the ocean of stories, truly an ocean of stories, for which Somadeva is credited as being the modern author of it. If you go to book one, you will remember that it begins with Shiva and Parvati, but Parvati wants to listen to a story that has never been heard, an absolutely original story. Shiva narrates it to her. However, the one who guards out, Pushpadanta, hears it and goes and tells his wife, Jaya, swearing her to secrecy. And of course, Jaya promptly comes back the next day to Parvati and says, "Oh, I know that original story, which only Shiva has told. I guess you." Parvati is, of course, angered. She goes back to Shiva and they find out Pushpatanta is the culprit who has overheard. And also, joining him in this task was Malyavan. And Parvati curses both of them that you will go down to earth, you will be humans, and you will have to wait for that opportunity till you meet that creature. And when you do, you will recollect all the stories, you will re narrate all the stories. Katha Sarit Sagar in this framework goes on, filled in with many, many, many stories. Interestingly, we never get to know what is the story that Shiva told Parvati. It is a self-effacing system where what really matters is the story and the telling and the listening and the telling and the telling and the listening and the telling and the listening. And at some point, perhaps the story even does not matter. With that, I come to the end of my memories of listening with one song that I would often hear from my Atte, my maternal aunt, which went like this: a story song which had its recall simply because it was a mnemonic for a story with 10 different elements, the Dashavatara. मत्स्य कूर्म वराह नर हरि वामन रूपा ओम रघुपति रघुपति कलहल जीरा कल की शरीरा ओम नारायण कल की शरीरा नारायण नारायण ओम हरि नारायण 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 ओम हरि नारायण 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 ओम हरि नारायण. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deepaji. I think it was fantastic. I was reminded that every time I would, see the Amarachitra Katha book of Mahabharata, I would imagine myself to be seated in front of Vaishampayana Maharshi when he was narrating the story to Janamejaya and others. I think, there is in our civilization, there is this element that when we listen to the story, we're actually somewhere there inside the story in one corner, witnessing it.